This is supposedly one of the greatest Latin American novels that you've never read. Carlos Fuentes is quoted as saying, one of the great novels, not only of Spanish America, but of our time. But after spending 500 pages in this nightmare, we're honestly not sure if it has anything to say. Is this a profound meditation on the decay of Chilean society, or is it really just an author who gets lost in his own madness? It's The Obscene Bird of Night by José Donoso.
Umberto had no talent for simplicity. He felt the need to twist normal things around, a kind of compulsion to take revenge and destroy. And he complicated and deformed his original project so much that it's as if he'd lost himself forever in the labyrinth he invented as he went along, a labyrinth that was filled with darkness and terrors more real than himself and his other characters. Always nebulous, fluctuating, never real human beings, always disguises, actors, dissolving grease paint. Yes, his obsessions and his hatreds were more important than the reality he needed to deny. Welcome to another episode of Books of Some Substance. I am your host, David Southard.
And I'm your host, Nathan Sharp. And today we're talking about José Donoso's The Obscene Bird of Night. So to kick things off, David, I want to ask you, how did you find this insane, disorienting, discombobulating, horrific Gothic novel?
Leading the witness there. So in addition to all of those adjectives, I found it to be mostly an incredibly fun reading experience, even though it was baffling, occasionally frustrating, almost never a boring experience for sure. In addition to the language and the nightmarish qualities, we've had this conversation many times, my brain wants to rationalize and try to understand things. So I was kind of reading it two different ways at the same time. One was just trying to experience the novel as it seems to want to be experienced, and the way that people often praise this book is as a reading experience itself, the overall experience of being stuck in this sort of nightmarish novel. So that was part of it. But then in the back of my head, I'm trying to piece these things together. How do they fit? What is he trying to say? And that part was difficult and kind of frustrating, but still fun and challenging overall, because there's all these shifts in point of view, shifts in time, shifts in reality, in description, mirrored character stories, everything kind of happening all at once occasionally. So yeah, I mean, you kind of gave it away as well. Did you have a similar, very different reading experience?
Yeah, well, I want to get into, and I want to hear your plot summary, because I tell you what, I could not follow the plot. I definitely took the method of just going with the flow. And it's a peculiar book because it's confusing, but not in the way that, say, William Gass is confusing, where it's just this flood of language that you kind of pick out things happening as this language is overwhelming you. It's like sentence to sentence, it makes sense. The Obscene Bird of Night. Page to page, it mostly makes sense. But then suddenly it'll just shift it to a different perspective, a different place, a different time. And there's no explanation. There's no seeming reason for it. And I found myself constantly, I mean, I'll be honest, I didn't really try that hard to figure it out. I just felt like I was tripping balls all the time and just waking up in a new place and okay, where am I now? And so I think my experience, page to page, I liked it pretty well. But as a whole experience, I struggled to hold it together in any meaningful way.
Yeah, and the opening quote that I read out kind of, I think, hints at Donoso's own understanding of what the novel problems or difficulties might be, because he often has that sort of metafictional slip into critiquing his very unreliable narrator's method of presenting all of this story as being difficult to follow. Why don't we take a couple look at a few passages that sort of represent this difficulty before we get into the plot specifically?
Yeah. Is there one that you have in mind?
Yeah. There's a couple. So I lie down on my bed. All my work will explode inside my body. Each fragment of my anatomy will acquire a life of its own. Outside mine, Umberto won't exist. Only these monsters. The despot who imprisoned me at La Rinconada to force me to invent him. Inez's honey complexion. Brigida's death. Iris Mataluna's hysterical pregnancy. The saintly girl who never beatified. Umberto Peñalosa's father pointing out Don Hieronymo dressed up to go to the jockey club. And your benign, kind hand, Mother Benita, that does not and will not let go of mine. And your attention fixed on these words of a mute. And your rosaries. The Casas La Rinconada, as it once was, as it is now, as it was afterwards, the escape, the crime, all of it alive in my brain. Petaponce's prism refracting and confusing everything and creating simultaneous and contradictory planes. Everything without ever reaching paper because I always hear voices and laughter enveloping and tying me up. And it kind of trails off and keeps going. But I think that captures a lot of, one, the characters that you meet throughout this book. There's a lot of them. And you kind of have to keep track of them because you will slip into one character's story and another's rather abruptly. You'll follow a new character and a new story for a moment. But all of it seems to be filtered through Umberto's mind, which is collapsing in on itself. And this is, of course, the person who wants to be a writer, who never writes anything. So he's kind of making stories in his head, but also falling apart psychically and mentally, and I think. And there's another passage, maybe you can read that one. That kind of puts you into Umberto's head a bit. But again, he's not always, I mean, even if he's not saying that he is narrating every point of it, everything does seem to be filtered through him in some way. So even when you're switching voices and characters, the style rarely changes. Does it?
I mean, I think to some degree, but to some degree it does change. Like when we shift to Mother Benita's point of view, and it's telling, I mean, and she's the I in this passage, and she's, you know, it's well before she interacts with Mudito Umberto. And we also shift into Don Hieronymo's perspective, which would appear to be different. It's told more directly, and it would appear to be different from the supposed biography that Umberto is working on of Don Hieronymo. So those are two major examples. But throughout the book, I feel like it also shifts, you know, kind of page to page. And maybe that's in his mind.
So like maybe those larger sections, like you mentioned, of Hieronymo and
Mother Benita.
Whatever, Mother Benita. There's also a large section where you're with Imperatrice, where she's thinking about escaping. But yeah, I think maybe you're right. Maybe those large sections were kind of we're given a little more traditional narrative style, but the vast majority you're stuck in Umberto or Mudito's head as he's describing things, and the point of view shifts. And I think the passage you're about to read, it shifts multiple times within a same paragraph.
No one was able to speak with Umberto Peñalosa, because as soon as he heard that name, he fled down the corridors into the depths of the casa. Umberto Peñalosa doesn't exist. He's an invention. He's not a person, but a character. No one can want to speak with him because they must know that he's a mute. His vulnerable shadow took cover far away in a room cluttered with bundles of newspapers and magazines the dampness had made soft. Mudito, don't go away, don't disappear. You'll starve to death. No, where are you, Mudito? Where are you? Looking for you will tire us out because we're old and feeble and we're terrified of sudden drafts. Don't go starving to death on us, Mudito. Look, even if we don't know where you're hiding, we're leaving you plates of food in the passages and corridors so you can eat when you feel like it, like a dog. But shadows don't eat until they dare become somebody, and the nameless shadow that feels no hunger wants to melt into the other shadows in the room, to shrink to newspaper size. The shadow without name or hunger shrinks as it hides the terror that stops it from mingling with the other shadows and acquiring the flat dimensions of a news item, squeezed into its hole in the dried up newspapers. Terror is centered in its smallness. It fills me till I can't bear myself, without movement, without hunger, without a voice, without hearing, blind almost. I mean, it's hard. These passages are so disorienting without being able to, I mean, they're disorienting in the novel, but disorienting without being able to place them anywhere in time, which we're going to get to in a moment. But in that passage, we have several points of view that it's shifting around. And we're also witnessing the dissolution of our main character, which we'll also get to soon. This is the moment of disillusion when he's transitioning from Umberto and refusing to hear his name into Mudito, the mute, in the casa. But we're shifting from his mind, his perspective, the old women's perspective, and there's some voice. Maybe people are saying this, maybe they're thinking this.
Maybe he's imagining them thinking this.
Exactly, and it's all kind of written in one paragraph and one flow.
And similar to the passage I read, there's another one, and this is just a quick line. He's talking to Inez, and he says, "I take your sleeping hand and brush my body with it. You have to recognize me, Inez. Accept me even if only for the moment, as I am, whoever I may be. Umberto, Mudito, old woman, baby, idiot, fluctuating damp spot on the wall. Awake now because you're touching me. Without, night sprawls over the countryside. The thrush keeps hopping, looking at us from his cage." So there's a lot of these moments where he acknowledges that he's multiple people, or he's taking on these multiple identities because, as you mentioned, this is, in large part, and we'll get to this when we talk about the themes, obsessed with this collapse of identity, of becoming nothing, becoming the
Imbunche.
becoming the Imbunche. That's another thing that's driving this sort of narrative force.
You mentioned the Imbunche. There's one other thing I want to bring up in this when we're talking about the experience of this, and that is just the sheer grotesqueness. The Imbunche, which is maybe the primary metaphor in the story itself, which we will get into in more detail, but I just want to read kind of how that is introduced in the story. And it's maybe not even the most grotesque image in the book. The Imbunche, all sewed up, eyes, mouth, anus, sex organ, nostrils, ears, hands, legs. From deep within her country's roots, in some region in some other century, when some half-Indian ancestor threatened in order to make her behave to change her into an Imbunche. The scared little girl that she must have been then, and the temptation she probably felt to become one, or create one, remained buried in Brigida's mind, and was now emerging in the form of an explanation of the future of Iris's child. So I believe that's early in the novel, and that's, I believe, when the Imbunche metaphor is brought up. And it continues to be brought up throughout the story. It's actually from Chilean folklore, and it's a pretty terrifying monster.
Just really quickly, we've read a lot of passages that showed, I think, some of the difficulty one might have when reading this. When you're reading this, are you taking notes? Are you trying to keep track of things? Are you highlighting? What do you do when you read this book, actually? Or any book, but this one, what do you do?
I pretty much, I when I read a book, I read through, I don't take notes. I don't kind of try to map things out or anything. I do highlight as I read, and then that's mostly for me to come back to. But I try to have a fairly naive first reading, generally.
Okay.
What about you?
I mark up the book, so like I'll write stuff, like notes to myself. I'll highlight things, and then if I if I read like for a large section at a time, maybe about an hour, then if I have time, I'll sit down before I start reading again and I'll do some like page number. Here's something interesting from this page, just to kind of keep my brain thinking about what's happening. Mostly because my reading is so scattered these days, I can't sit for extended periods of time to read. So like I'll read for
Yeah.
an hour and then I won't be able to read again for another couple days, just because life. So having those notes help me. I look through those before I pick back in to the book.
I can see how that might help tremendously in this particular
Yeah,
reading.
yeah. And the reason why it will help maybe will become clear when we try to very terribly explain the plot right now.
Yeah, that's what. Let's get
Okay.
into it. David, you said that you know what actually happens, so I'm dying
Okay.
to know.
So how I imagine the novel working, even though it kind of jumps around in time a little bit, it does still kind of follow a progression or a chronological order somewhat. You get flashbacks here and there. But how I imagine the novel working is just based on our narrator's sort of point of view. We'll start there. Umberto is a young man, young boy, whose father wants his son to be someone and pushes that on him quite a lot. He bumps into Don Geronimo on the street one day. Both him and his father recognize this as a somebody. Down the line, Umberto is a poor college student who wants to be a writer and gains some confidence and introduces himself in some cool way to Don Geronimo. I cannot exactly remember how, but he impresses him in some way. And Geronimo offers to help get his book published, like a small book of his, which he does. And then Humberto becomes his servant or assistant. As his assistant, Humberto becomes involved in Chilean politics after returning home from Europe. His brother, who is a priest in the church, the Catholic Church, which is a big part of this book, convinces him to get into politics. He becomes a politician. Of course, he's one of the wealthy aristocratic, and there is a mob waiting for him outside of a fancy clubhouse who is very angry. And I can't remember why. Do you remember why? They're angry at him for some reason. And there's a mob. There's a mob waiting for him. And Don Geronimo and Humberto leave the clubhouse to try to go to their car, are swarmed and flee into another space, maybe a church. I think it's a church. Yes, it's a church. And they try to flee out the window, but Don Geronimo knows that the mob is waiting for him, so Humberto is sent in his place wearing his clothing. Humberto is shot, not killed, but shot, and the mob sort of respects that they think he was shot because Don Geronimo leaves the church seemingly unscathed or, not dead, and takes credit for being shot but still facing the mob. Humberto holds this as a slight against him. While Don Geronimo triumphed in the town square disguised as Humberto Peñalosa, the car in which I traveled, doubled up with the pain from Don Geronimo's wound, jogged along the dirt roads that led to La Rinconada at that time. Yes, he'd stolen my wound, Mother Benita, but let me tell you this. Nobody steals a wound without paying for it. If he'd wanted to borrow it, I would have lent it to him, because I admired Don Geronimo. But he stole it from me while I was still unconscious. He took it without asking me, convinced that my wound, like everything else of mine, was his property. But by stealing it from me, he left me whole, without a wound. So that begins, I think, where Humberto sort of loses respect for Don Geronimo. And later that night, Humberto impregnates Don Geronimo's wife, Inez, who seems to be under the spell of Pedaponce. a witch, and their story lines up with another girl witch, girl saint story that keeps being replayed throughout the novel. This leads to the birth of a monster, the boy. The boy's birth not forces, but Don Hieronymo believes that because he doesn't want to kill the boy, he still wants to create some, I don't really know why. There's talk about it. Can you? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, can I read, because there's a passage from, supposedly from Umberto Peñalosa's book, which introduces boy. And if I'm not mistaken, it was also the first thing that José Donoso wrote of this novel. And then it eventually was not the introduction to the novel. It was the introduction to the novel inside of the novel. So, and where this appears in the story is Umberto, I think he's still Umberto and not Mudito.
But he was Mudito at the very beginning of the
being
book.
Comforted. Well, it in our chronology, because he was Mudito in the beginning, but I think we've jumped back in time because now he's being taken in by Mother Benita.
He's not fully Mudito,
and being comforted by her. So he's not fully Mudito, and he quotes from memory this passage from his book. Hieronymo de Azcoitía finally parted the crib's curtains to look at his long-awaited offspring. He wanted to kill him then and there. The loathsome, gnarled body writhing on its hump, its mouth a gaping bestial hole in which lips, palate, and nose bared obscene bones and tissues, in an incoherent cluster of reddish features, was chaos, disorder, a different but worse form of death. Until then, the noble family tree of the Azcoitías, whose name he was the last to bear, had produced only select flawless fruit. Forthright politicians, bishops and archbishops, and a saintly girl of noteworthy piety. Plenipotentiaries abroad, women of dazzling beauty, soldiers who'd been generous with their blood, and even a historian renowned throughout the continent. It was fair to expect that Hieronymo wouldn't be the last Azcoitía, that the luster of the name would continue in the seed of sons and grandsons, so that the stock would go on producing more and more perfect fruit until the end of time.
There's this desire for his family name to carry on. That's part of it that keeps him from wanting to kill the boy. There's also some hint.
But let's also point out, from what you just said, boy is not actually his son.
That he knows.
Well, it's actually Mudito's, Umberto Peñalosa's, possibly. Although it's also not clear, because like the passage you just read, he said that's when I became Hieronymo, when I took that bullet for him, and he stole the wound. This is one of those identity sort of flips that I don't really, I think the ambiguity is deliberate. Maybe we can ask, what does it mean if this nobody becomes the future of Chilean nobility? This nobody replaces the aristocracy and gives birth to this monster by breeding into this line. I mean, that's one reading of it.
Another reading is that it is Don Hieronymo's son, and that this is the end result of aristocratic lineage.
And it's the end result of stealing the wounds of the less fortunate.
I mean, we're only a quarter of the way into the novel in terms of plot line. But so Don Hieronymo sets up La Rinconada, which is an estate that he owns. And with the help of Umberto and his cousin Imperatrice, they build a world of monsters to keep the boy enclosed into this make-believe land where everybody is a monster or a freak of some kind, and are not exposed to the real world as a way to make him feel normal, the boy. That's the plan anyway. So this is built. It runs smoothly for a while, kind of smoothly. Something happens. It's a combination of Umberto losing his mind, convinced that people are out to get him, things are happening. I'm not entirely sure what causes it, but he abandons La Rinconada. In his mind, it seems that Don Geronimo has captured him and put him into a hospital to take out his organs and use his blood to keep him alive. It's very unclear. That part gets real surreal and trippy and seems to mirror the author's own experience in the hospital when he was given morphine and was allergic to it and had a sort of psychotic break for a week.
Mm-hmm.
Something happens and Umberto flees and ends up at the Casa. The Casa is an old nunnery, I believe. It's like a nunnery / orphanage that is just falling apart. It's in disarray. It's in decay.
And the nunnery is owned by Geronimo also. It's part of his whole...
Yes. It's owned by Geronimo, and his wife Inez has taken up residence there and is also in the process of trying to get her namesake, a distant relative Inez, sainthood. So she's there, but she's also in Europe for most of it. But anyway, Umberto becomes Mudito at this falling apart casa, a mute that helps the elderly and these orphan children. He becomes infatuated with a young orphan girl named Iris, also known as Gina, and helps her escape at night so that she can go out and party with someone known as the Giant, which is just like a poor man who has a giant papier-mâché head used for advertising local stores by handing out leaflets, it seems. Mm-hmm. And Mudito, at this point, makes a deal with the Giant to rent out the papier-mâché head to himself and to others so that they could sleep with the orphan girl Iris. She gets pregnant either by Umberto or at one point Don Geronimo stops by to sleep with her. She gets pregnant. The old women in the casa think it's a miracle pregnancy. And she is slowly giving birth in secret. Some of the old women are trying to protect her so that the other old women don't find out. Eventually, she gives birth, and Mudito sort of becomes the baby. The casa is shut down by the church.
He becomes the baby twice.
Well, at one point, he's pretending to be a baby, just like an old woman is pretending to be a baby so that Iris can learn how to take care of children. But it's more like literally he seems to become the baby.
Yeah.
As the casa is being shut down and everyone's kicked out, Iris ends up getting into a taxi with some strange dude. The women depart, and Mudito is buried in rags that eventually end up with an old woman under a bridge with some other old homeless people, where he is emptied out, seemingly as scraps of paper and firewood, into a fire, and becomes nothing.
But a stain of soot.
And so throughout, we're bouncing around, we're bouncing in and out of people's minds. We're not sure what's real, what's not. Umberto is obsessed with this. He has this paranoid fear that Don Geronimo is out to get him, and he just wants to disappear. He's constantly talking about becoming nothing, disappearing, becoming an Imbunche. Yeah, that's the plot of the novel as I see it.
It's so chopped up. I mean, the very beginning of the novel is very close to the end of the chronology, yes. Right? I mean, you first meet Iris Metaluna and she's going out with the giant and gets pregnant. And then for the next 500 pages, she's basically pregnant for 500 pages. But in the chronology that you just described, that would actually happen towards the end of the chronology. And then it jumps around in time. And each of these periods of time also kind of correspond with places. You have the Casa, you have Rinconada, you have, those are the two main places, and you have kind of the street or the space between. And to be perfectly honest, I did not follow that plot. When you said that this happens in a linear time, that kind of blew my mind. Because I didn't even attempt to put it together on time-wise. I kind of experienced it simultaneously. But you saying that, you describing it that way, suddenly makes the book make a lot more sense. And what I want to know is, why did he break it up this way? Do you think that it helps the story? Does it help the novel in some way? Or does it make it unnecessarily difficult and confusing?
I think it depends what you think the book is trying to do ultimately, or if it's trying to mirror the themes that it seems to be obsessed with. Because thematically, it kind of makes sense with who our narrator is and what his obsessions are. But whether or not it serves the reader.
Let me frame it this way. How difficult was it for you to piece all that together? Because I could imagine you could write the book that's chopped up and still provide a sort of map so that a reader could follow it without having to make that map themselves. So how difficult was that for you to sort of piece all that back together? And was that, and this is kind of a personal question, because I think people would answer this question differently. How do you like to read a book? But from your perspective, is that, well, just how do you judge that?
It's difficult if difficulty is equated to the amount of time or page count it takes to kind of realize what's happening. Because like you said, reading it is not difficult. It's not sentence to sentence, paragraph to paragraph, page to page. It's well written. Everything's moving. There's things happening. So you're not just kind of stuck in passages of dense language or zero plot movement or zero character movement. So things are happening. So like you can kind of follow along. But in terms of understanding how things are fitting together, that is a little more difficult, because it takes time and things aren't made clear. On a very simple level, the idea that Umberto and Mudito are the same person, even though he kind of hints at it, wasn't that clear to me until much later in the book than it probably should have been.
Same.
Even little things. In the very beginning, they're talking about the giant. I literally thought there was a giant for pages. I was like, oh, a giant. Okay, well, this makes sense. This book is strange. There's probably a giant. And then I was like, oh, it's just a papier-mâché head. Okay. That took a few pages before it became clear, because the novel doesn't lend itself to clarity in any real way.
Mm-hmm.
So if that is something you are not interested in, this book would be a literal nightmare to read. But I didn't mind it. I didn't mind it in terms of like understanding what my possible problem with it is, that I'm not sure how well it serves whatever, if there is some kind of overall feeling that the book, other than a feeling, but an actual like purpose of the book. Because the feeling itself is one of confusion, horror, disgust.
And that's I think that's the powerful takeaway of the book, is that feeling.
Yeah.
But maybe to get to the if there's a theme to be had, and we're going to get into this, if there's a theme to discover, I think it's really useful to understand what you just laid out. And so it would seem that Donoso has buried that and made it more about this impression. I would say the immediate impression of the book is what's foremost. You're just like, ugh. this is uncomfortable. This is confusing. This is gross. And you kind of have to wade through that nightmarish layer to maybe get at what is it he's actually saying.
So why don't we get into some of those themes? Because I think the themes actually hint at what he's ultimately getting at.
I think there's three lenses we can use to look through to better understand what this book might be trying to say. Lens one is the lens of identity and erasure. I think this is talked about a lot in criticism and reviews of the book. We talked about it already. Umberto Mudito, he takes on different identities through the course of the novel. Lens two is this aspect of decay, the decay of the casa, the decay of aristocracy, and Donoso explores this, I think, through three epochs of Chilean history. And then finally, Lens 3 is the novel that eats itself. It's a more a formal way of looking at the novel. It's about writing a novel and the difficulty of that, the difficulty of having a voice, and that sort of battle that the author has with the story as it comes to be.
Why don't we work through those backwards in that order? Does that sound fair to you?
Sounds good to me.
All right. So this is the novel eating itself. I just want to read the intro by the author Alejandro Zambra, which is also worth reading. I'm just going to read two little quotes from that.
Okay.
The first one, and this is his list of themes: abnormality, sterility, illness, deformity, inheritance, paternity, identity, subalternity, monstrosity, exploitation, obsession, senescence, madness, paranoia, paternalism, parochialism, isolation. The list of this novel's themes demonstrate both its richness and the futility of reducing to component parts a work that aspires to describe the variegated complexity of human experience. He also says that the novel is, in fact, is defiant toward its very condition as a novel. And then at the very end of his introduction, he makes reference to a quote in the book about a deity creating the world of the novel. And he says, "I chose that particular image because there are more than a few moments when the prevailing impression, absurd and contradictory, is that the novel has won and the novelist has lost. Absurd because the magisterial and meticulous and excessive representation of failure is, of course, the most radical triumph, this novel's greatest triumph. While that may be true, it also seems contradictory. Because I think the novel wins.
Mm-hmm.
I think the novel wins. I think in this case.
The author can't find his way out of the labyrinth that he's created.
I think so. I don't know, because the ending really does seem to pull it off in a way for me that I really like. But in the experience itself, in those dense 500 pages, as a reader, it feels you're lost because the author is lost in some ways. Mm-hmm. Or the author wants you to feel lost. But then again, we get to the question of why, and we can't really answer that. And some of the quotes that we made reference to about him sort of metafictionally aware of his narrator / himself being sort of trapped in all of these creations and not really knowing how to get out of them.
You know, I don't want to be unfair. However, the chopped up nature of the book almost seems to me like a Band-Aid over a narrative that can't quite get there.
Okay.
It's like, well, let's just add an entire new layer of confusion and let the reader figure it out.
Yeah. It's like when I was in college and couldn't really play guitar, so I started a noise rock band. And I said, this is music.
Exactly. Yeah. Because he's trying to do, the novel is trying to do so much. And I think that list that you read is spot on. There's so many, take different aspects of the book, different pieces of the book, and you could say, oh, well, that's what it's about. But does it cohere into anything? coherent. And isn't that what a novel is? And now he gives him a lot of grace by saying that he's, giving the middle finger to the form of the novel itself. But at the end of the day, it's a novel. Doesn't that mean anything?
Yeah. If the purpose of it is to show that the novel could exist as a monster, so to speak, which is all of these different parts seemingly connected, somewhat disparate, but still coming together as the shape of a human, like the boy.
Mm-hmm.
So is it kind of like a thing where he's kind of forcing you, like someone in society who would look at that boy as a freak, as a monster, to, as a reader, to look at this and see something else that could be just as good, just as great, just as normal as a novel, something like that? Maybe? I don't know. I think that's a way to read it.
That's an interesting read. I like the, because there's a passage. Actually, I want to find it. So this is talking about them designing La Rinconada so that boy doesn't feel othered. Don Hieronymo saw to all these details because nothing around boy must be ugly, mean, or ignoble. Ugliness is one thing, but monstrosity is something else again. Something of a significance that was equal but antithetical to the significance of beauty, and as such it merited similar prerogatives. Monstrosity was the only thing Don Hieronymo de Azcoitía would set before his son from his birth on.
It says, yes, Don Hieronymo warned Dr. Azula must do everything that could be done to make boy live, but there was one error he mustn't commit. Nothing must induce him to make any cowardly attempts to disguise anything that wasn't normal with an imitation of normality or change boy's condition of monster. Every effort in this direction should be superficial, a matter of skin and fibers that wouldn't erase his insulting abandonment by every power. Any effort to copy beauty would mean imposing on his son a humiliating mask to cover up a defeat that, inverted and viewed in a different perspective, should be a triumph. In a way, it's almost like that's his plan for the novel, this is what's in my head. What comes out, I'm not going to try to shape to fit a standard of beauty that I don't think should exist, at least not in this instance, perhaps. And again, I'm projecting. I have no idea what José Donoso actually intended. But I think that you can see the connection there between these two ideas. And if that's true, then the author and the novel both win. Or it's a draw.
There was one other quote that I wanted to find. Face to face with this elite of first-class monsters who'd look after boy and educate him, Hieronymo had to perform the delicate task of convincing them that the anomalous being, the freak, doesn't represent an inferior condition of the human species, one that men have the right to look down on and pity. These, Don Hieronymo explained, are primitive reactions that hide the ambiguity of unexpressed feelings like envy, or the shameful eroticism produced in people by extraordinary beings like them, the monsters. Because normal humanity has only the courage to react to the usual gradations that range from the beautiful to the ugly, which, in the long run, are nothing but nuances of the same thing. The monster, on the other hand, Don Hieronymo contended with feeling, in order to exalt them with this mystique, belongs to a different, privileged species, with its own rights and particular canons that exclude the concepts of beauty and ugliness as tenuous categories. Because, in essence, monstrosity is the culmination of both qualities, synthesized and exacerbated to the sublime. Terrified by the exceptional being, normal beings locked him up in institutions or in circus cages, boxing him in with their scorn in order to snatch their power. But he, Hieronymo de Azcoitía, was going to give them back their prerogatives, redoubled, centuplicated.
This is the beauty of talking about a novel, because this notion of what the boy and La Rinconada represented did not occur to me until a couple minutes ago when we started talking about it. And it makes sense in my head now, in a way that makes me appreciate the book more.
Yeah, well, this is kind of turning it upside down for me too, because I hadn't found this, honestly, this lens to be all that
Yeah,
interesting
me neither.
until
Yeah,
right now. And I'm like, oh man, because this is kind of, if you look at it from this lens, um, it kind of inverts lens two. That it's not so much about decay; it's about uh the or it's not a yeah, it's not about decay. It's not about a degradation. It's about creating a new thing and celebrating that new thing.
at the same time keeping it removed from reality.
Because La Rinconada is a farce.
He doesn't want time to exist. He doesn't want the boy to know about life and death. And one afternoon, when Brother Mateo, next to the fireplace, displayed the astrolabes and maps of the complete geography of the universe, which was only the sky and the earth of the patios at La Rinconada, they'd already decided, among all of them, that these wouldn't be necessary, for Boy was to grow up believing that things came into being as his eyes discovered them, and died when he stopped looking at them, that they were nothing but the outer shell perceived by his eyes, that other forms of birth and death didn't exist. And so much was this the case, that the most important among the words Boy must never know were all those signifying origin and end. No whys, whens, outsides, insides, befores, afters, no arriving or leaving, no systems or generalizations. A bird crossing the sky at a certain time was not a bird crossing the sky at a certain time. It wasn't headed for other places because other places didn't exist, nor into other times because other times didn't exist. Boy must live in an enchanted present, in the limbo of accident, of the particular circumstance, in the isolation of object and moment, without a key or meaning that could subject him to a rule, and in subjecting him to it, cast him into the infinite and unanswerable void to which he must remain oblivious.
Wow. Yeah, and that opens up another line of thinking, which maybe this got into my subconscious unwittingly, because it's just been something I've been thinking about a lot lately, and that is the the philosophical debate between phenomenological perspective of the world, or phenomenological root of meaning, which is what you just read, is pretty well describes the idea of phenomenology, and a more rational view of the world, the abstracted, universal view of the world. And so I think it was worth noting too that Don Hieronymo, the designer and creator of this world, the creator of Boy, is ultimately murdered by Boy in Rinconada in a very brutal and cruel and heartless way.
And the one moment he attempts to become a part of that world or sort of see that world, he's murdered by his son.
And so that seems to, we were just talking about this is maybe the celebration of the monster, this celebration of individuality. But that environment is is destructive and nihilistic and chaotic. So then is that a judgment on this world of La Rinconada? Maybe this segues a little bit into Lens 2.
Yeah.
And I think there's a big question: is La Rinconada sort of a success or a failure? Maybe in Lens 3, maybe it's a success. If the book is a success, the book is a monster. La Rinconada is sort of the peak of that celebration of monstrosity as individual expression. And maybe this doesn't totally not work with Lens 2. Because what I think Lens 2 is about, when we think of decay and all the decay in the book, the decay of the casa, the decay of religion, the desanctification of the chapel, the birth of this monster that ends the line of aristocracy. Um, it's all throughout the story. And I think specifically when thinking about this reading of the book, it's important to understand what was going on in Chile when it was published, or right before it was published. And that is, it was published in 1970, which was the same year that Allende became president of Chile, with all this promise of change, this promise of modernization, of socializing the country. And 3 years after that, Pinochet successfully led a coup, and Chile became this sort of very repressive regime.
Yeah. Very quickly.
And all of the,
Oh, sorry.
yeah.
Oh,
No, go ahead.
just there's one little quote from the very beginning of the book that kind of talks about hope. And you mentioned this book was published in 1970, where there was this idea of revolutionary hope. And he's talking about the casa. Although the casa was his until he got rid of it, he shouldn't have done it. It was a mistake. And here's the quote: "One should hang on to things. There's always some hope left."
I mean, that's very interesting. But one should always hold on to
Yeah.
things. One hold on to the past, because there's always hope.
Which is kind of what Geronimo is trying to do by setting up La Rinconada. In a way.
I would argue
Or
not
not, yeah.
so much. I mean, in my reading of it, this is a fairly, negative reading, is that La Rinconada represents the change. La Rinconada represents this experiment in egalitarianism, the destruction of aristocracy, the bringing down of hierarchy, the bringing down of the scale of beauty to ugliness, and leveling it out into the monstrosity of individuality. That no one can judge another because you're all monstrous and you don't exist on a scale. So it's the disposing of, and the not holding on to old things. And it would seem that maybe Donoso isn't entirely on board with this idea. But I think it's important to look at these three epochs, if you will, because he's really not on board with any of it. You see the failure of the aristocracy, the unfairness of the aristocracy, the decadence of the aristocracy. You had a great passage about how, I guess this is Boy, but Boy is also the last line of this aristocracy, and he's saying, I don't want to go out into the world. I want my servants to go out in the world. I don't want to see it.
Here's the quote. He said, and he's quoting a poet. A poet said, "Live. Live? What is that? Why not let our servants do it for us? You're my servants. You'll experience what I refuse to experience. Now that I know reality, only the artificial interests me."
This aristocratic order insulating itself from real life and putting up its own facade for its own entertainment or its own comfort. And then, so we have those two epochs, the sort of liberal, egalitarian, socialist future, the failing aristocracy, and then the past, the very present legend and folklore that permeates the whole novel. The Imbunche, the story of Inez, the story of the witches, all the superstition of the old ladies, which is the sort of the past, Chile's deep past. And all three of these in 1970 are living alongside each other. You know, I mean, that's the thing, is like, it wasn't like one ended and another epoch began. They were all coexistent. And our hero, Umberto, is trying to find, in all three of these epochs, he's trying to find himself. He's trying to escape silence, and eventually decides not to escape, to just hold himself in. And that each of these three epochs, each of these three ways of seeing the world fail him. And I guess, I mean, this you could look at this as another way of looking at identity, that you aren't identified outside of your social context, and this is these three overlapping social contexts that anybody in Chile would be living
Yeah.
with at this point in time.
And that they all shape you in some way.
Right. And in this context, I think Donoso presents no hope. No, there's no the individual gets crushed regardless of how you look at it.
I mean, it's certainly no character comes out of this novel unscathed or triumphant in any way. Maybe Boy.
Except maybe, and maybe the witches.
No, but they lose
I
their
think.
casa. They're scattered at the end of the novel.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
true.
You're talking about the old women who have this mix of folklore plus Catholic tradition, which I think is accurate as well. This sort of blending of myth and religion, and but yeah,
Hmm.
they're kicked out because Inez can't keep the casa, or doesn't want to, or is unable to. It's not entirely clear. The church gets rid of it or sells it
Hmm.
off, auctions it off. Maybe Boy, because as far as we know, La Rinconada doesn't die, and Peretrice becomes the sole inheritor of that estate before death. So there's a sense that as a facade, as a world within a world, will continue to exist for a while anyway.
Until 1973. I mean, it's really hard not to read that context into it, not to read like, yeah, obviously he didn't know Pinochet was coming into power and was going to like destroy this whole facade of egalitarianism. But there's a sense of dread, I think, in the whole novel,
Yeah.
which at a time of great political hope for many people in Chile is interesting, that maybe not everybody felt this hope. Maybe people felt some degree of trepidation about the changes that were coming, even if they weren't totally enamored with the past either. And I wanted to see if Donoso had written anything more specific, more nonfiction about the revolution or the coup, about Allende, about any of that, because he lived a great deal of his life outside of Chile, or his adult life. But as far as I could find, he didn't really. He was against the coup, but wasn't especially outspoken politically, and he was of more aristocratic middle class, upper middle class upbringing. Had a something of a famous name, but was also uncomfortable with the idea of aristocracy. And I think a lot of his novels, not just this one, but a lot of his novels deal with that world and what he saw as the decadence of that world.
Yeah. I mean, that's certainly clear in this, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
I like your second lens as a way to view bigger outside forces in this novel. Like that works.
Well, what about lens one? What do you think about the lens of looking at this through the lens of identity?
I think it's rightfully placed at the top of a lot of people's discussion on this novel because it's the most explicitly clear. Our narrator constantly, from early childhood to his eventual turning into the Imbunche or death or whatever happens at the end of the book, however you read that, is a move towards this crisis of identity, right? So early on in the book, we kind of get a glimpse into Umberto's childhood. And I'm going to kind of read a few just like snippets from a few different pages, but this is all kind of focused on his experience with his father. The only forebear my father could recall was his own father, the railroad engineer. Beyond that, there was only the obscurity of people like ourselves, people without an individual family history, people who belong to the masses, among whom identities and facts are blotted out and give birth to popular legends and traditions. I can hear my father's voice as he sat by our lamp that reeked of kerosene. At night, after eating a stew that contained more of my mother's imagination than substance, my father would lay plans for me so that somehow I would fit into something other than the emptiness of our sorry family that was without a history or traditions or rituals or memories. And the wistful evening would unfold to the accompaniment of the hopeful voice in which my father expressed his longing to make something of me, and the insistent leak in the ceiling that stubbornly contradicted him as the drops of water plopped into the chamber pot. My father used to explain everything to me, with the vehemence of his tender but bashful hand that wanted to touch mine but didn't dare across the tablecloth embroidered by my sister, who succeeded in disguising the ordinariness of our table but not its wobble. He'd demand without demanding that I amount to something. Yes, Dad, of course I can. Why not? I promise, I swear. I'll be somebody. Instead of this sorry Peñalosa face without features, I'll acquire a magnificent mask, a great big, bright, smiling face with well-defined features, a face no one can fail to admire. And pitying me and my futile undertaking, my mother would lift her eyes for a second, look at me, and then she'd fix them again on the skirt she was mending for some wealthy matron in the neighborhood. Someone, to be someone. From the very first, my mother knew I'd never be anyone. And then a little bit later on the next page, he didn't have his sights that high, but who knows, with sacrifice and hard work, I might get to be something at least bearing some resemblance to those men of importance my father was in awe of. A facsimile that would build a bridge, any kind, provided it was honorable, that would enable me to brush up against them. Why not? Becoming someone, escaping from the limbo inhabited by the faceless. My father was unable to escape. He never tried. For him, the world of the others, of those who were someone in their own right, known people, was of magical proportions and fabulous consequence. Anyway, there's like pages of this in this section of his father just keep instilling this idea that we are nothing, they are something, you need to be someone. And they make a couple of notes of him bumping into Don Geronimo as a child and how that kind of triggered something in his father and in himself. And then we jump to him much later working for Don Geronimo. And his identity has only become attached to this man who is someone, this aristocratic person.
Mm.
And his efforts, his desires to be a writer fall away. And then throughout the novel, he's constantly referring to the Imbunche, which we've talked about. And he's obsessed with the idea of becoming one or having been made into one, almost as if he feels like it's inescapable.
Let's pause and talk about the Imbunche for a second. Because there's an aspect of the Imbunche that he doesn't express in the novel. So in Imbunche, in folklore, in Chilean folklore, it's actually a really interesting story. It first was recorded in 1880 in possibly the last witch trial on Earth, when one farmer who was a warlock or claimed to be a warlock in this clan of warlocks on the island of Chiloe in the far south of Chile, claimed to have visited this cave of the king warlock. This is in his testimony. And when the warlock did a magic spell and opened the cave, out rushed these two monsters, one of which was an Imbunche, which is like what he describes in the novel. All its orifices sewn up, its leg bent and broken behind its back, its arm inserted into its under its skin. This is a horrific thing. And in folklore, it would have been stolen from some villager when it was a baby and raised in darkness and in ignorance. So it never learned to speak. It never learned to communicate. But after spending all this time in the cave around the warlock, around these spells, it acquired the skills of the warlock.
Yeah, that is not mentioned in this novel.
No. So it was this horrible servant enslaved to the powerful. Like he is kind of indebted to Hieronymo, but by its proximity acquires some of the powers.
Which he displays
And I
as
think,
Mudito in a weird way,
yeah,
manipulating people.
I mean, in some way, isn't that the writer, the author, in the abstract? You are around things happening in the world, and by your proximity to those, you can create a novel, you can write a story, you can take some of that power and express it in this other way, but you can't speak that power. You can't be that power. It's a very specific myth. It's a very Chilean myth, so it's very esoteric. It doesn't even exist in Latin America,
Yeah.
beyond Chile. So he could hardly expect anybody to pick up on that. Any average reader to pick
On
up on
that
that.
aspect, no, because otherwise he clearly lays out what an Imbunche is in the novel, and it's described at least 2 or 3 times, I would think.
Right, right.
Interesting. I wonder why that part was left out.
I think it adds an interesting little a strange twist to the Imbunche, because he wants to be an Imbunche. Why does he want to be an Imbunche? What's your reading? Like, why would he want to be an Imbunche? Why does he keep bringing this up?
So I think the reason why I read that section about his father, because I think that instilled something in him that I think disturbed our narrator. And not to go all Freudian or anything, but I think the father definitely hindered his perception of himself in the world, even though he kind of knew his father was living in a fantasy land and he seemed to understand his role as nothing in the world. Maybe that was in him from the beginning, that he knew he would never really amount to much. And so he kept, the way that when you're not feeling particularly good about yourself, you sort of undermine yourself by saying horrible things. I think there's something to that in there. I think there's possibly failures to write, which is a common thing that Umberto brings up over and over again, which again might be part of the author's metafictional play. And I think this desire to become erased, to become nothing, it might be all of these things that we've been talking about, the social, the cultural, the personal, the weight of all of these things informing and altering who you are and what you are, to the point where you do feel like you are an Imbunche. I think that plays something in it. And I think that desire to slowly get erased, right? Because he goes from being a young man, being an author, putting his word out into the world, then becoming an assistant, someone who takes a bullet, doesn't get credit for it, someone who might have given another woman a child, doesn't get credit for it. Slowly he's erasing himself. He becomes Mudito. Even though he can speak, he becomes mute, willfully mute, because he doesn't want to talk. He gives up his blood, his organs, possibly. Mm-hmm. And there's this strong desire to just slowly remove yourself bit by bit. And in the end, there seems to be regret about it. Did you pick up on that in the final part of the book?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it is pretty beautiful and sad.
Yeah, I'm just going to read.
When he finally gets to the point of complete dissolution, and he's like, I don't want this.
Yeah. So he's slowly being wrapped in rags and bundles as the women flee the abandoned casa. Of stones and fragments of wood and leaves and branches that will eventually rot or dry up, of lumps of earth, of occasional pieces of painted plaster, an eye, a dragon's jaw, rags, papers that will gradually disintegrate, sacks where there may be someone screaming, "No, save me, I don't want to die, I'm afraid. I'm so weak, stiff, unable to move, without sex, without anything raised, but I won't scream. Because there are no other forms of existence. I'm safe here inside this bundle I've never come out of, owner of this hole that lodges me perfectly because it owns me. They say there are ephemeral passageways, useless courts, hallways with simulated perspectives, objects whose use no one remembers, and that are stacked in piles, splotches of decay slowly spreading their landscape over the walls, the light veil of dust falling from the worm-eaten wood, rooms filled with silence no one's ever broken because there's never been anyone in them. Although they say there has been, and that there still may be, but I don't believe it. Someone's stirring in a corner out there. There is someone. There is an out there. There is another cough besides mine, but so weak that it may not be a cough. There is a movement I'm no longer capable of. It's very slight, like that made by shadows as they take shape and move without footsteps because there are no feet to make them. It's neither cat nor dog nor rat nor fowl nor bat nor rabbit. I hear breathing beside me even though I can't hear. How is it possible to cough so weakly even if it's nothing but a structure of shadows I need to see? I need, and terror sets in with need. The need to see the face of that shadow breathing and coughing so close. To recover my sight and the out there, I bite, I chew the sack that covers my mouth, gnawing away to discover the features of the shadow that exists out there. I chew cords, knots, patches, ropes. I bite my way through, but never enough. Another sack, another layer. It will take me a century to conquer and a millennium to get past. And it goes on and on like this stream of conscious, this language that's almost like late Beckett, where he's, there's nothing, just this consciousness, but it's still, he's this dying body, this disappearing body that seems to want to live.
And right past there, where you were just saying, there's a line. I have to go on gnawing because there's someone waiting outside to tell me my name. And I want to hear it. And I chew and bite and tear.
There's this regret that seeps in at the end. That after all of this effort to erase himself, he doesn't want to be erased. Much darker, sadder book, actually, than just this character disappearing, but wanting to be erased, only to realize what a huge mistake you've made.
That line, this like he's been erased. It's somewhere out there, someone knows who he is, and he just wants to hear his name again. Compare this to what we read earlier, when he's transforming into Mudito and he's running away. If he hears his name, he runs away. He rejects his identity. He rejects his name because his name reminds him of the nothing that he is.
It's really quite beautiful, actually. It's sad.
Well, and this brings me back to the form of the book. Like, that is a beautiful, sad story. And it takes so much, like the book itself is wrapped in rags. You have to peel through to understand what it's trying to say. That it's really, that it is a story of a person born without privilege, trying to make something of himself, giving up, despairing, and dying alone. Does it need all these layers on top of it?
I think the story isn't that complicated, but Donoso makes it complicated on purpose in order to bring that difficulty of knowing yourself, of even recognizing your identity, of dealing with all of these things at the same time. It's sort of like the novel, and this, I guess this is the question we were trying to ask. Is the novel trying to do too much? Because I think the novel is doing so many different things at the same time. And I think the form of the novel represents that as well. That all of these themes, all of these ideas are burdensome, and the form needs to somehow match that.
It's funny. I wasn't sure what we were going to talk about with this book. After I finished reading it, I just felt that was very, very weird and confusing. And I had been looking for themes as I was reading it, and it didn't, a lot of the things didn't seem to hold up to the reading experience. And it's one of these books that I think is much richer by talking about
Yes.
it. This discussion has made me like the book a lot more.
Yeah. And hopefully it makes other people like it more.
He's placed in that Latin boom author sort of category. And it's definitely not Marquez. Like, there's an element of magic in this. There's an element of the sort of mystical. But you said this in our preparation. It's a much sort of dirtier magic.
Yeah.
And it's not fun in the way that Marquez's writing is. And so I think that if that's kind of what you're looking for, that's not the experience that this book is going to provide. But I think, I mean, having talked about it, I've kind of changed my mind about this. Like, it is a book worth thinking about. It's a book worth spending some time with. It's a book worth using as a vehicle to think about identity and history and your role in the world. It's not just a sort of menagerie of horrors. Thanks for joining us for this discussion of José Donoso's The Obscene Bird of Night. We hope you enjoyed the episode. We hope you enjoyed the book. We'd love to hear what you thought about it, what you thought about this episode, and what you thought about the work. So please leave us a comment. We try to respond to the comments, especially on our YouTube. And you can follow us on our YouTube, on Instagram, on Twitter, or X, at BookSoSubstance. And please also remember to like and subscribe wherever you listen to this. That helps other people to find the podcast. That helps us to spread the love of reading, put more of these books in front of more people. So we'd really appreciate it if you could do that. Up next, we have a classic work of modernism. I think the language would be slightly less grotesque than this one. We're going to be reading To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. So pick that up, read along. That episode will be coming out in the next, I'm not going to make any promises. We don't really keep to a schedule very well. But anyway, thanks for listening. And until next time, happy reading.